In 2023, a titan of the wargaming industry retired from their position at Games Workshop after a long career of producing iconic, genre-defining artwork. And that is none other than John Blanche, whose art is said by many to have established not only the aesthetic and tone of the Warhammer universes, but of Grimdark as a whole. And today, I'm gonna try and take his artwork and shrink it down to miniature size. Blanche's artwork was foundational to my first experiences with Warhammer. I can remember the first time I cracked open a 40k rulebook, which was a gargantuan tome in my tiny hands at the time. I was blown away by just how grim and grimy and, well, weird all of the artwork was. And that's in large part due to Blanche's illustrations and art direction. His depiction of the Emperor on the Golden Throne, the Imperial Palace, aliens, heretics, all iconic. But I think most impactful for me personally was his depiction of the Adeptus Mechanicus. When I think of Space Marines, I think of the 4th edition Codex, but when I think of AdMech, or really any of the other esoteric Imperial institutions like the Inquisition, it's Blanche all the way, baby. His color palette and his line work just perfectly get across how atrophied, hopeless, and, well, grimdark the Imperium is. Despite being nominally retired, you may have noticed Blanche's name all over the internet recently, and that is because he is keeping busy in his retirement. Notably playing a large role in the upcoming documentary The Grim and the Dark: The Search for John Blanche, which is being made by Napoleon Dynamite of all people. But he's also partnered with the Army Painter to release a signature paint range, which I'm sure that you've seen all over YouTube by now. So this is where I pull out my fancy review copy of the new paint range, right? Well, unfortunately, I did not receive one.
Lois, there's no presents under the tree!
So instead, we'll be attempting to replicate Blanche's iconic art style with just a little bit of artistic analysis and the paints that many of you will already have on your desk. As for today's canvas, we have this Ubasi Captain from Trench Crusade. If you've been living under a rock for the past couple of months, Trench Crusade is the smash hit tabletop skirmish game that is currently gunning for the Grimdark throne. The creators of Trench Crusade are actually big Blanche fans themselves, so much so that they actually managed to recruit him to do some art for their game. Given the aesthetic sensibilities of this new model range, I think they're a natural fit. To start things off, I'm going to lay down some underpainting, but I'm not going to start with black. Instead, I'm going to be using a dark, rich brown like Rhinox hide, but if you don't have that specific paint, any similar brown will do. If you're curious why I avoid black when underpainting to the extent that I ever use that technique at all, click the video linked above. Now, I typically don't like to paint using underpainting, or the slap chop method as it's sometimes called, just because I feel like it tends to dull out the colors too much, and it can sometimes make the shadows a little bit too dark and desaturated. But funnily enough, that's actually what we're gonna be looking for today, and so it's a perfect place to start. I'm not gonna spend too much time describing how slap chop works. There's a billion videos on it already all over YouTube. Basically, the idea is we're sort of pre-shading the model by dry brushing up successive layers. I went from my dark brown base into Vallejo tan yellow, then into Vallejo elfic flesh, and finally a pure white just at the highest points. So if I don't like underpainting that much, why am I using it here? Well, let's take a look at my reference for this painting project. Two things stand out to me right away. The first is that the shadows are really, really dark. There's a ton of contrast here. The second is that the colors have an almost watercolor-like quality to them. I believe Blanche used a lot of inks while painting. Our underpainting is going to facilitate us replicating these characteristics because we already have those deep shadows built in, and we're gonna have to glaze our colors on top, which mimics the watercolors and inks that Blanche used. For the next step, let's start staining that gold armor. I'll be using two colors to start out with, and that is Filthy Brown and Ochre Brown, both from Vallejo. The key is going to be thinning these paints way down to a glaze consistency. Remember, we're trying to mimic watercolors here. We really just need to stain the surface with our color because, for the most part, we've already built in our highlights and shadows. If we go back to our reference photo for a moment, you'll see that Blanche loves to bring in other colors as we start to approach our deepest shadows. You'll see that here in the gold there are oranges and reds, and while not present in this picture specifically, I've seen in other ones that he also sometimes likes to bring in greens. So let's do the same on the model and bring some vibrancy and visual interest to our shading. This is one of those areas where I sometimes think people get the wrong idea about Blanche's work, where they just think of it as dark, and because of that limited color palette, they think that it's not really all that vibrant, but there really is a lot of richness to be found in those limited color choices that he makes. The colors that I've chosen here are Burnt Orange from Pro Acryl, Mephiston Red from Games Workshop, and Russian Green from Vallejo. Next up, I'm going to be painting like all of the cloth bits and the plume on the helmet of this model in a very, very rich red, again drawing from our reference image of the Custody. It is very important for us to get as vibrant and undiluted of a red as we can here, and that's because Blanche uses something that approximates the Zorn palette. The Zorn palette is a limited color palette that consists of 4 paints: cadmium red, yellow ochre, a blue-black, and pure white. Now, Blanche actually denies ever purposefully using the Zorn palette. In fact, my understanding is that he was once asked about it, and his response was, what's that? But the Zorn palette has been used quite a lot through art history. You see it in the works of some of the old masters like Caravaggio and Velázquez. However, Blanche has said that some of his work has been inspired by historical painters. He stated in an interview that this piece in particular came to him after a visit to the Louvre. So could it be that Blanche was subconsciously inspired to use something like the Zorn palette just through his interest in art history? Who's to say? If you ever get a chance to ask him, let me know what he says. Now, I am not going to be using the Zorn palette because I am lazy and I'm just going to pick paints out of my pile over on my desk. But if you want to use it and get really, really good at paint mixing, it's a great exercise. So let's get to filling in those reds. For this step, I'm doing a much more traditional opaque base coat just because I want to maintain as much saturation as possible. And we're going to carry over that philosophy to our highlights too. It can be so easy to accidentally desaturate a red by highlighting too much. So I'm keeping my highlights pretty minimal. We're going to create depth with some shading that we're going to do later. The colors that I've chosen for this step are Mephiston Red from Games Workshop, Cador Red from the new P3 paint line, and then finally Amaranth Red from Vallejo. Before we move on, let's just quickly add some color to the other parts of the model. Adding some nice desaturated blue-grays to both the metal and the weird booby bird thing is going to create some nice contrast with all of the warm colors on the rest of the model. As I mentioned earlier, Blanche does not religiously stick to the Zorn palette. What's most important is fitting the vibe of his work, and so making color choices that include some cool colors can sometimes be appropriate. The color that I'm using to fill in the metallics in the wings of the bird is Oxford Blue from Vallejo, which actually has a distinct purple hue to it, which doesn't really fit the Zorn palette, but I still like it for this purpose. Next up, we're going to play around with some washes, specifically Agrax Earthshade. If you've ever spent any time on the Blanchitsu painting subreddit, you'll know that Agrax Earthshade is a mainstay of the style. In fact, there's a bit of a meme in the community that all you really need to do to paint like Blanche is just dunk the whole model directly into a pool of agrax. But we're going to be a little bit more measured in our approach. I have diluted my agrax down 50-50 with some Lamian medium. The reason that I'm doing this is that I don't want it to affect the colors that I've already laid down too much. In fact, I'll actively be trying to guide the wash into the recesses that I want it to go into, rather than just slathering it all over. Blanche does sometimes do some more traditional sci-fi and fantasy artwork, particularly for box covers that he's done for Games Workshop, but my favorite pieces of his are always the really sketchy looking ones. And that is what we're sort of trying to recreate here by doing all of this dark lining with the wash. We're trying to give it a much more illustrated feel, as if somebody outlined every one of the shapes on this model with a pen. There is actually a notable shortcoming trying to achieve this effect with this method. I wonder if any of you can predict it, but I will talk about it at the end of the video. Now we can finish off the armor by doing some highlighting. Let's take a look at our reference image once again. What I notice is that the highlights, especially on the gold armor, are very suggestive rather than fully fleshed out and rendered, if that makes any sense. Blanche's artwork is definitely highly stylized, much more than it is hyper-realistic. I suspect that Blanche creates these highlights by not covering these sections and just letting the paper color show through. I do think that I covered a little bit too much with my yellows, so I'm going to go back in manually and lighten things up. We can pick a few key areas to go in with some off-white to evoke the illusion of shine, but I don't want to get too bogged down here doing super realistic non-metallic metal. Instead, we can rely heavily on our reference images to figure out where our highlight placement will have the most impact. Let's head back to the artwork of the Custodes one more time, because I want to look at one last key element of Blanche's artwork. Not only does he use color to build depth, but he also does it through his line work. Take a look at the darkest parts of both the armor and all of the reds. You can see that there is a ton of hatching and cross-hatching in there that he's done with the pen. These are techniques that he uses quite often, in addition to sometimes stippling with the pen too. A lot of miniature painters also use these techniques, but we tend to do it in reverse, using them to build up highlights rather than shading. That makes taking what Blanche does in his illustrations and translating it onto a model a little bit difficult for me. Not to mention, thus far in my painting career, I've been trying to get as precise and as detailed and as realistic as possible, but for this, we need to get a little messy with it. So let's go ahead and start getting those shadows real dark. Another reason why this is sort of uncomfortable for me is that I am breaking one of my cardinal rules, and that is to never use pure black. But this is a special situation where we're trying to mimic a black pen on paper, so it is appropriate. We're almost done now. The last thing that I want to focus on is the weird booby eagle thing. I actually chose this model for this project specifically because of that strange bird, because it just screams Blanche. It reminds me very much of all of the ugly little flying things that can be seen in the background of some of his larger artworks, like the servo skulls and the cherubs. And I'm really glad that cherubs have remained an integral part of the 40K aesthetic into modern times. Seeing people get weirded out by that when Space Marine 2 released was very entertaining. Now, I've already prepped the surface of the wings with just a little bit more dry brushing that I did off camera using that same Oxford blue. And to really make the wings pop, we'll just need to do a little bit more edge highlighting. To do this, I took that Oxford blue and mixed it with a little bit of bright warm gray from Pro Acryl. Next, we can move on to the flesh tones. I'm going to start out by glazing in some green into the areas that I want to be in shadow. I'll be using that same Vallejo Russian green that I used earlier. This'll give the skin a really kind of sickly and strange feel to it that'll help sell the fact that this bird thing is maybe not quite natural. And in that same vein, when we start on our highlights, I'm going to be using that same Vallejo tan yellow color that I used earlier in the video, both to conform to our limited color palette idea, but also to give the flesh a little bit of a jaundiced look. And then for our brightest highlights, I used that same bright warm gray from the wings to keep things very desaturated. I didn't really do any blending here at all. This is all just very rough layering to keep it consistent with the sketchy look that I want. And to finish it off, we'll give it some beady, eerie red eyes. Before I reveal to you the final finished model, I want to talk to you about my first ever channel sponsor, Raid Shadow Legend. Okay, no, I'm just kidding. The real sponsor is actually something super cool. Battlebarge, the world's first Warhammer 40,000 and tabletop wargaming cruise. Yes, that's right, 40K on the high seas. This cruise will be taking place at the beginning of October 2025, and it is a 7-day luxury cruise aboard one of the world's largest cruise ships, the Harmony of the Seas by Royal Caribbean. Over the course of those 7 days, the event organizers will be running a narrative Warhammer 40,000 campaign where everyone will bring a travel-friendly 1,000 point list and participate in 2v2 team matches. But if full-scale 40K isn't your bag, they're also going to be running games of Kill Team, and if even that isn't enough to float your boat, pun very much intended, then you can join their Discord where I'm sure that you'll be able to find someone to set up a game or two of a system of your choice. Perhaps even Trench Crusade. If you think that this sounds awesome and you really want to go, check out my affiliate link down below and use code Heretics and Heroes for $50 off your booking. Every purchase using my link and code will directly support the channel, and it will help me get one step closer to being able to afford to attend the cruise myself. So get to booking, and I hope to see you there. And fucking uninstall Honey from your browser, they're gonna steal my money. Now back to what you were all waiting for. Think I did. I like it overall, but I do have some self-critique here. I definitely think that I nailed the color palette, but in terms of capturing the whole vibe of Blanche's artwork, I think it fell a little bit short. The main culprit being it's just too clean. I'm so used to painting for realism that I didn't get loose enough with it to really capture the grittiness and dirtiness of Blanche's artwork. Counterintuitively, I think that all of the dark lining that I did with the Agrax Earthshade actually worked against me because yes, it did give it a bit of an illustrated look, but just in the nature of it being a wash, it settled into the recesses of the model, which are all nice, clean, well-defined lines. And cleanly defined is not exactly what Blanche is known for. If I ever try this painting style again, I'm gonna lean much harder into just looking at the kind of macro shapes and laying down my color according to that, and then being very, very selective later on with which details I actually give any specific attention to. Let me know if reattempting a project like this is something that you'd like to see. All right, final conclusions. Blanche is obviously a master, and it has been a wonderful exercise trying to translate 2D art onto a three-dimensional miniature, especially because of how hard it was to translate that style from one medium to another. It's an exercise that really forces you to engage with a piece of art and figure out what makes it work. Not all of my decisions were perfect, but I did get a pretty nice looking mini out of it at the very end. And no, you don't need a fancy new paint set to pull it off. Well, that's it for today. Thanks for watching, everyone. Make sure that you like, subscribe, hit the bell notification icon, all of that nonsense. And if you enjoy my content, please consider supporting the channel by joining my Patreon. There you'll get access to my Discord server where me and my patrons hang out, talk about all things hobby related, give each other tips and tricks, and just generally hype each other up. You'll also get all the behind the scenes updates, written painting guides, reference photo libraries, exclusive tutorial videos, and even personalized painting instruction. I am about to start crunch time for preparing my Golden Demon entry, so if you'd like to follow along with that, get yourself into the Discord. Thanks again, and as always, I'll see you on the tabletop.